Hello, my IBMOR brothers, in for another one. I've had quite a few of my subs email me articles talking about intermarriage just ahead of June 12th anniversary of Loving versus Virginia, the Supreme Court decision that struck down the miscegenation laws and allowed Americans to marry anyone of any ethnicity. And they asked me about my particular take on it. The Pew Research Company organization, they did a study on the increase of interracial marriage. And I'm going to read an article from time.com that actually talks about it. And then I'll be back on the other side to give my take on interracial marriage.
Americans are marrying people of other races than ever before, by Belinda Luscombe. On June 12, 2017, it will have been 50 years since the U.S. Supreme Court decided that Americans should in fact be allowed to marry a partner of whatever race they want. Since then, many American couples have availed themselves of that right, although white people remain much less likely to marry another race than people of other races. According to a new report from Pew Research, 5 times as many people who married in 2015 chose partners from a different race or ethnicity as those who married in 1967. That's 17% of all newlyweds, or 1 in 6, that year. The largest increase was among African Americans. Since 1980, the number of black spouses who intermarried has increased from 5% to 18%. And the number of whites who intermarried increased from 4% to 11% the same period. Pew defines intermarriage as between 2 different races as well as between a Hispanic and a non-Hispanic, even if they are of the same race. The newlyweds most likely to be intermarried are Asian or Hispanic. Almost 30% of Asians who married in 2015 wed someone of another race, and about 27% of Hispanics married a non-Hispanic, says Pew. But the rate of intermarriage has stopped growing among those groups. In 1980, for example, 33% of newlywed Asians were marrying non-Asians, the most common interracial match by far. 40% of all intermarriages is that between a Hispanic person and a white person. Gretchen Livingston, a senior researcher at Pew who authored the report, says whites have the lowest rate of intermarriage partly because of the number of potential partners who are white. If you're living in a place where 85% of the marriage market is white and you're white, there's a low probability that you will marry someone who is not white, she says. As shown in the map above, intermarriage occurs least in the places where the fewest minorities live. But that same math does not seem to apply to Hispanics. Clearly, there's something else going on, said Livingston, because if you look over time, the share of Hispanics in the country has risen a lot, but frankly, their rate of intermarriage has not really changed. It can't just be about the availability of potential spouses who are Hispanic. Gender matters more in some races than others. In 2015, black grooms, 24%, were twice as likely to have a partner of a different race or ethnicity as black brides, 12%, a trend that hasn't budged much in the past few years. Conversely, Asian brides, 36%, were much more likely to have walked down the aisle toward a partner of different race than Asian grooms, 21%, were to be waiting for one. And yet another sign that marriage is a very different institution among wealthy and the less well-off. Education changes how likely it is that newlyweds are intermarried. The more educated a partner is, no matter the race, the higher the likelihood that his or her new spouse is from a different race or ethnicity. While intermarriage numbers represent a considerable change, they are dwarfed by the adjustment in attitudes towards it. In 1990, almost 2/3 of Americans who weren't black said they would be opposed to a close friend or relative marrying someone who was. That figure is now at 14%, a dramatic drop. Disapproval dropped among all other races as well. In just 7 years, the share of adults saying that the growing number of people marrying someone of a different race is good for society has risen 15 points to 39%, says Pew. which commissioned a new survey in February to accompany the report. In 2014, the figure was 37%. African Americans are the outliers. Almost 1 in 5 thinks intermarriage is bad for society, but most people of any race said that they didn't think it made any difference. Livingston says she would love to get her hands on some sort of attitudinal data broken out by gender so she could begin to tease out the gender imbalance amongst different races. Do opinions about the marital choices of black women and Asian dudes differ from those of black men and Asian women? Is it somehow more frowned upon for them to marry across racial or ethnic lines? I would love to have attitudinal breaks on race and gender to see if it would explain some of what's going on, she says. She'd like to understand why African Americans are more likely to think that intermarriage is bad for society than other races. That's really a striking finding. And that is from time.com. So America having achieved its melting pot dream finally by basically integrating all the races and all of its American citizens, it can go on to do other things. And that 200, almost 300-year-old Negro question that has been floating around since the beginning of the country will finally go away. So what does that mean? What does that mean for people in general and black folks in particular? Assimilation is the stated policy of the United States and has been for a very, very long time. Normally it takes 140, 150 years to have a cultural change. Like segregation was not built in a day. It wasn't built in a decade. It was a slow process over a couple hundred years. And to dismantle it takes 7 generations. Now, if you take from 1945 to now, that's about 70 years, so we're halfway through the cycle. And if you look at the interracial marriage rate, it kind of reflects that, even though it got started late. So if you look at, I think it was the last year was 2015, it was a quarter of black men were marrying somebody of another race. That is right in line with the stated goal of the United States. It's something that you would seem to expect as you start being in the neighborhoods, being in the classrooms, being around each other more. You're going to see this more and more. The only places it's not happening is in middle America, where the population is still about 90% white. There's very few minorities or people of color. But in the places where black people and white people mix, black people and other races of people mix, then you see the integration rate or the intermarriage rate go way up. All the stats point to this progression. The United States wants to be a country of income class rather than a country of a caste system, like the caste system we've had for the last 250 years. Things like gentrification, suburbs, Section 8, all that stuff is reflecting a class versus caste system. The caste system is going away. So for the black people that are pro-black or black nationalists, I keep saying over and over and over again, if you want the community to remain black and your children and your grandchildren to remain what we call black as a caste system, you're going to have to leave the United States. Because the likelihood that you're going to form a black nation or a cohesive black group in the United States, the environment doesn't lean toward that. It's not conducive for that. And then eventually, over the next couple hundred years, I don't think it'll make much difference anyway. Having racial identities, which was a very recent and short-lived idea, will finally go away. And it'll be more about culture, land, culture, and proximity than it will be about race or color or that kind of identity, which is either a good thing or a bad thing, depending on which side of the coin that your beliefs actually lie on. I'm going to do a couple of more videos on this. It's interesting to see the progression of a nation's culture as it actually goes from
amalgamation, which is groups coming together, to integration, which is where we are now, to cohesiveness, which is where we're headed. That's the state of all nations, no matter where they're at. You can go to any country you choose, or any society that you choose. If it's large enough, you will see the exact same thing. The only difference between this and what normally happens is that the United States is accelerating the process by force. You will integrate. Your children will marry people that don't necessarily look like you, whether it's your children or your grandchildren, or even your great-grandchildren. Within 3 generations, this will be done. You're already gone through 3.5, maybe 4. In another 3 generations, it'll be done. So for folks that don't like it, I don't know what to tell you. It is what it is. That is the process of the world. This is the process that human beings go by. And eventually, those things come to pass. But with that, I'm going to get out of here. That's all I got for this one. This is BGS